budget request for the Army for fiscal year 2015. We welcome back to the Capitol our friend and former colleague, the Honorable John McHugh, Secretary of the Army, and General Ray Odierno, Chief of Staff of the Army. I speak for everybody in this room when I thank both of you for your long and valuable service, and to the men and women you represent who have had repeated deployments overseas and make up the force that continues to serve in Afghanistan as we speak here this morning. We honor all of those, and we particularly honor those who have paid the supreme sacrifice, as well as those who've had physical and mental wounds, who live with the war each and every day. We honor all of them. There are many challenges facing our great Army and this morning we'll discuss personnel issues, readiness, equipment modernization and reset, current operations in Afghanistan, obligations to the Pacific region, research and development, and the lack of an overseas contingent operations budget, among other important topics. The Army budget proposal is $116 billion. In addition, the Department of Defense has forwarded an $80 billion placeholder in lieu of a formal request for funding of overseas contingency operations. These operations, war operations, are still essential to the safety of our troops and to our national security, and to security in that part of the world, a very dangerous and unpredictable place. We've discussed this in private, but I'll say it again publicly. This committee, in the strongest possible terms, urges the Department of Defense and all of our services to work together to provide us with verifiable and defensible line item data on projected costs of our overseas operations as quickly as possible. We have a bill to write. Of course, the committee is very concerned about the challenges facing the Army for current operations and readiness. We understand the difficulty in reducing spending in operating personnel and modernization accounts in order to satisfy budget control requirements. But we've made a decision to leave. We've left Iraq, and we're exiting Afghanistan. And of course, one might anticipate that we would have reductions in a variety of accounts, including end strength. Innovative thinking is required, and the road to a lower top line is never smooth. We expect to have a thoughtful discussion on force structure and personnel, and also on several major programs. A new infantry fighting vehicle remains a major goal for the Army, as does the continuation of fielding components of the information network of sensors, software, and radios that the Army has been assembling since 2011. Your proposed aviation restructure is designed to retire all OH-58 series helicopters, the Army's only remaining single-engine helicopter. The active component will downsize by 887 helicopters, and the Army National Guard will cut 111 helicopters. However, the plan moves all of the Apaches from the Army Guard to serve as reconnaissance helicopter for the active component. Whether or not to keep Apaches in the Army Guard remains a contentious issue. Last point, the Army is people. There is no room for sexual assault in its ranks. Good soldiers do not abuse one another, and this committee nor Congress will tolerate it. We'll ask our witnesses for their summarized statements in a moment, but I do want to recognize the distinguished ranking member, Mr. Visclosky, for any comments he may wish to make.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you holding the hearing, gentlemen, for your service and your attendance today, and do want to associate myself with the Chairman's remark in their entirety, but particularly his comments about the Overseas Contingency Operation Fund. And again, we have had discussions, but as the Chairman pointed out, we do have legislation that will be on the floor shortly. So appreciate your comments, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Visclosky. Secretary McHugh, thank you for being with us this morning.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Distinguished Ranking Member Visclosky, fellow former colleagues, members of the subcommittee, I deeply appreciate the opportunity. This is my fifth chance to appear before you to talk about the work of our soldiers, our civilians, and our leaders over this past year, and to, as you said, Mr. Chairman, discuss the very important matters of the current state of America's Army and what I think we can all agree are very uncertain and perilous times that lie ahead, particularly if the requirements in this, our budget proposal, should not be approved. I think it's important that I be clear up front. The time for action is now, and perhaps more than any other time, certainly in recent years, we need your leadership, we need your help and your support. We must have this budget to properly restructure, reduce, and to revamp our force, and quite frankly, we need it to protect your Army as we march into a dangerous and unpredictable future. As members of the subcommittee, you know full well that the cuts that we have already endured from the Budget Control Act and sequestration have significantly damaged our readiness, drastically reduced our modernization programs, and demanded, as the chairman noted, sharp cuts to our end strength. These, coupled with a significant shortfall for the Army in 2013 and OCO funding, caused us to enter this year with a $3.2 billion hole in readiness alone. The bipartisan budget agreement does happily provide some temporary relief, but we still are implementing a $7.7 billion cut to our fiscal year 14 budget request. And to meet our top line requirements, we've had to cut another $12.7 billion from our 15 submission. In order to protect current operations, our combat power, as well as our soldiers and their families, we've been forced to make extremely hard choices in this budget that impact virtually every component, every post-camp and station, and limit nearly every modernization and investment program. Trust me, this is not what we wanted. It's not what I think your Army deserves, but it is what we have had to do to preserve America's land power in such an austere fiscal environment as constructed by the dictates approved in law. Nevertheless, in spite of turbulent funding and tremendous change, I think it's fair to say this past year has been one of great transition, transformation, and yes, triumph for America's Army, not just here at home, but across the globe as well. From intense combat to counterterrorism and retrograde to humanitarian relief, disaster assistance, and regional engagement, your soldiers and civilians from every component, active, National Guard and Reserve, have seen unprecedented success, saved countless lives, and promoted freedom and democracy in some 150 nations around the world. In Afghanistan, as your Army continued to fight insurgents and terrorists, we further transitioned into a training and support role, helping to set conditions for elections in April and appropriate withdrawal in December. Simultaneously, we are conducting one of the largest retrograde operations in history, returning, removing, or demilitarizing some 580,000 pieces of equipment in the past 12 months alone. We plan to retrograde $10.2 billion of the Army's $15.5 billion in equipment that currently remains there. From Europe to the rebalance to the Pacific to South America and beyond, as our forces perform vital missions around the world and began a major transformation to reorganize our brigade combat teams, we've also accelerated end strength and cut our headquarters staff. All of these things designed to protect critical readiness and seek more balance under these budgetary constraints. As we continue to retrograde, restructure, and reduce, we also continued our transition to decisive action training, replacing our recent focus on counterinsurgency. Unfortunately, due to severe cuts in fiscal year 13, we were forced to cancel 7 combat training rotations and significantly reduce home station training. Although we ensured deploying units were fully trained, sequestration cuts directly impacted the training, readiness, and leader development of more than 2 divisions worth of soldiers. Although our readiness levels will increase through this year and into 15, the looming return of sequestration in 16 will quickly erode these gains. I'd be very remiss if I did not mention the extraordinary burden our civilian employees have faced over the past year through pay freezes and furloughs. Although our fiscal year 14 appropriation brought some relief, I truly fear we've yet to see the true impacts of these cuts on their morale and their retention. Our fiscal year budget reflects the challenging fiscal times in which we live by making the hard strategic choices now. It contains a number of very difficult decisions to further reduce end strength, realign our aviation assets, prioritize near-term readiness, and protect our soldier and family programs. We do much of this by taking calculated risk in modernization and facility initiatives. This budget as such is lean, it is stark, but it is critical to meeting the needs of our nation and our soldiers. In this request, we'll begin further reduction to our end strength, reaching 450,000 active, 335,000 Guard, and 195,000 Reserve soldiers by the end of fiscal year 13. It's important to note that we are also adjusting our force mix in favor of the Reserve component. This is the maximum end strength we believe we can afford to protect readiness and the minimum we need to execute the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance. Nevertheless, this clearly is not without risk. As the Chairman mentioned, we must restructure our aviation portfolio. We know this is controversial, but we believe we have no choice. The money is gone, and we must rebalance these vital assets in a way that maximizes our readiness and minimizes costs across all components. This initiative will generate significant savings by reducing our total number of platforms from 7 to 4. We'll divest the older, less capable Kiowa and TH-67 trainers in favor of Apaches and Lakotas. In support, the Guard will transfer their low-density, high-demand Apache attack helicopters to the active Army and receive over 100 of our most modern Blackhawks, a plane which is far more ideal for their dual combat and state support role. This is the right thing to do. It allows us to better sustain, modernize, more capable fleet across all components and significantly reduce sustainment costs. Once again, the vast majority of these cuts, a total of 86%, come from the active Army. Overall, the Guard's fleet will decline by just 8%, while the active force declines by some 23%. As you said, Mr. Chairman, at its core, our Army is people. Accordingly, we're committed to protecting effective soldier, civilian, and family programs, and where appropriate, adding resources. In fact, we increased funding by nearly 46% across a myriad of programs associated with our Ready and Resilient campaign. From the prevention of sexual harassment, assault, and suicide to transition assistance and comprehensive soldier and family fitness, we are determined to meet the needs of our warriors, employees, and families. We have a sacred covenant with all those who serve and with all who support them, and we will do everything within our power not to break it. On a final note, let me take a moment to mention BRAC. I know that's not popular. As a member, I went through 3 rounds. I had a base close in my district, and I recognize that authorizing another BRAC is a difficult step to take. But it was necessary during the last round in 2005, and I would argue it's even more necessary now. We cannot afford to pay for the maintenance and upkeep of unused or unnecessary facilities. It wastes money we just don't have. As I noted, we didn't want to make a number of these hard decisions. We didn't want to limit our programs or further cut our end strength, but we had no choice. Nevertheless, we believe we've developed a plan that balances the need of our nation, our soldiers, and family members against severe budget constraints and calculated risk. This is where we need your leadership, your support, your help. If our planned reductions and realignments are derailed or delayed, we do not have the funding, we don't have the time to adjust. Simply put, we need protection, and we need predictability, not politics. In conclusion, on behalf of the men and women of your Army, let me thank you for your continued and thoughtful oversight, your steadfast support, and proud partnership. Let's go forth together to help safeguard the most capable land force the world has ever known as we prepare to meet the unforeseen challenges that lie ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for an excellent statement. General Odierno, good morning, and thank you for being with us again.
Thank you, Chairman Freeling-Heisen, Ranking Member Visclosky, other distinguished members of the committee. Despite declining resources, the demand for Army forces continues to increase. More than 70,000 soldiers are deployed today on contingency operations, and about 85,000 soldiers are forward stationed in nearly 150 countries, including nearly 20,000 on the Korean Peninsula. Our soldiers, civilians, and family members continue to serve with the competence, commitment, and character that our great nation deserves. As we consider the future roles and missions of our Army, it's imperative we consider the world as it exists, not as one we wish it to be. The recent headlines alone, Russia's annexation of the Crimea, the intractable Syrian civil war, missile launches by North Korea, just to name a few, remind us of the complexity and uncertainty inherent in the international security environment. It demands that we make prudent decisions about the future capability and capacity that we need within our Army. Therefore, we must ensure our Army has the ability to rapidly respond to conduct the entire range of military operations, from humanitarian assistance and stability operations to general war. The 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review builds on the defense priorities outlined in the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance. Last year, I testified that we can implement the defense guidance at moderate risk with an end strength of 490,000 in the active Army, 350,000 in the National Guard, and 202,000 in the U.S. Army Reserve. I stand by that assessment. However, given that sequestration cuts are the law of the land and remain, in fiscal year 16, we must take deliberate action now to prepare. Therefore, in order to attain the proper balance between end strength, readiness, and modernization by the end of sequestration, we'll have no choice but to slash end strength again beginning in FY16. We will be required to further reduce the active Army to 420,000, the National Guard to 315,000, and the U.S. Army Reserve to 185,000. At these end strength funding levels, we will not be able to execute the defense strategy. And in my opinion, this will call into question our ability to execute even one prolonged, multi-phase major contingency operation. I also have deep concerns that our Army at these end strength levels will not have sufficient capacity to meet ongoing operational commitments and simultaneously train to sustained appropriate readiness levels. The President's budget submission supports end strength levels at 440 to 450,000 in the active Army, 335,000 in the Army National Guard, and 195,000 in the U.S. Army Reserve. I believe this should be the absolute floor for end strength reductions. In order to execute the defense strategy, it's important to note that as we continue to lose end strength, our flexibility deteriorates, as does our ability to react to strategic surprise. My experience tells me that our assumptions about the duration and size of future conflicts, allied contributions, and the need to conduct post-conflict stability operations are overly optimistic. And if these assumptions are wrong, our risk grows significantly even at the 440 to 450 levels. For the next 3 to 4 years, we are reducing end strength as quickly as possible while still meeting our operational commitments. As we continue to draw down and restructure into a smaller force, the Army will continue to have degraded readiness and extensive modernization shortfalls. This has required us to implement tiered readiness as a bridging strategy in the near term. Our acquisition funding, which has declined 39% since the FY12 budget planning cycle, will continue to suffer. At the end of fiscal year 19, under sequestration, we will begin to establish the appropriate balance between end strength, readiness, and modernization, but for an Army that is much smaller. From FY20 to 23, we begin to achieve our readiness goals and reinvest in our modernization programs. Under the President's budget, we achieved balance between end strength, readiness, and modernization 3 to 5 years earlier, around FY18, and at greater total force levels. In order to meet the reduction imposed by sequestration, we have worked with the leadership across all our components on a total force policy that ensures the proper balance for all components. In developing our plan, we took the Secretary of Defense guidance to not retain structure at the expense of readiness. Additionally, the Secretary of the Army and I directed that cuts should come disproportionately from the active force before reducing the National Guard and U.S. Army Reserve. Our total force policy was informed by the lessons learned during the last 13 years of war. We considered operational commitments, readiness levels, future requirements, and costs. The result is a plan that recognizes the unique attributes, responsibilities, and complementary nature of each component while ensuring our Guard and reserves are maintained as an operational and not strategic reserve. Ongoing reductions coupled with sequestration level cuts over the next 7 years will result in a reduction of 150,000 soldiers and 687 aircraft and up to 46% of the brigade combat teams from the active Army. The National Guard will reduce by 43,000 soldiers, 111 aircraft, and up to 22% of the brigade combat teams. And the U.S. Army Reserve will reduce by 20,000 soldiers. These end strength cuts to the active Army will represent 70% of the total end strength reductions, compared with 20% from the National Guard and 10% from the U.S. Army Reserve. This will result in the Guard and Reserves comprising 54% of the total Army end strength, while the active component will comprise 46%. The Army will be the only service in which the Reserve outnumbers the active component. Under sequestration, we cannot afford to maintain our current aviation structure and still sustain modernization while providing trained and ready aviation units across all three components. Therefore, we have developed an innovative concept to restructure our aviation fleet to address these issues. Overall, we believe this plan will generate a total savings of $12.7 billion over the POM. Of the 798 total aircraft reduced under this plan, 687 aircraft, or 86%, will come out of the active component, and 111 aircraft, or 14%, will come from the National Guard. This will also include the transfer of over 100 modernized UH-60s to the Guard. As with end strength, we have disproportionately taken cuts from the active component aviation. And in fact, we will eliminate 3 full combat aviation brigades out of the active component, while the National Guard sustains all of its brigade structure. This plan allows the Army to eliminate obsolete airframes, modernize the fleet, and sustain pilot proficiency across the total force. The result is an active and reserve aviation force mix with more capable and prepared formations that are able to respond to contingencies at home and abroad. Let me be very clear. These are not cuts we want to take, but we must take based upon sequestration. I believe our recommendation delivers the best total Army for the budget that we've been allocated. The Secretary and I understand that the American people hold us to a higher standard of character and behavior. Combating sexual assault and harassment remains our top priority. Over the past year, the Army has established more stringent screening criteria and background checks for those serving in positions of trust. Army commanders continue to prosecute the most serious sexual assault offenses at a rate more than double that of our civilian jurisdictions, including many cases that civilian authorities refuse to pursue. We appreciate the continued focus of Congress as we implement legislative reforms to enhance the rights of survivors and improve our military justice system. We continue to take this issue very seriously, and I also know much work remains to be done in this area. We're also aggressively and comprehensively tackling the issue of ethical leadership, both individually, organizationally, and through systematic reviews. We've initiated 360-degree assessments on all officers, especially commanders. We've implemented a new officer evaluation report to strengthen accountability. For our general officers, we conduct peer surveys and developed a specific ethics focus as part of our senior leader education program. And we've also implemented 360-degree evaluations. We also appreciate help with 2 issues impacting our ability to maintain the right balance for our Army. First, the base realignment closure process is a proven, fair, and cost-effective means to address excess installation capacity. With the reduction of over 200,000 soldiers from our Army and lower budgets, we need a BRAC to reduce unsustainable infrastructure. Second, we are extremely grateful for the high quality care and compensation provided to our soldiers. We have endorsed proposals that recognize their incredible service while allowing us to better balance future investments in readiness, modernization, and compensation. We must keep in mind that it's not a matter of if, but when we will deploy our Army to defend this great nation. We have done it in every decade since World War II. It is incumbent on all of us to ensure our soldiers are highly trained, equipped, and organized. If we do not, they will bear the heavy burden of our miscalculations. I am proud to wear this uniform and represent the soldiers of the active Army, the Army National Guard, and the U.S. Army Reserve. Their sacrifices have been unprecedented over the last 13 years. We must provide them with the necessary resources for success in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the entire committee for allowing me to testify here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General Odierno. I'm pleased to yield my time for the first line of questioning to Mr. Womack, who's, as you're aware, has had a distinguished career as a member of the, I think 30-year career as a member of the Arkansas National Guard. Mr. Womack, the time is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me just say at the outset how much I admire the work of the Secretary and the Chief here for the terrific job that they have ahead of them, the challenges they face, and the tremendous demands that we are putting on these gentlemen and the men and women that they represent. And I'll just say this at the outset, that we owe you certainty. We owe the country certainty, and we have fallen short in that area, and I'm hopeful that we can give you the certainty that you need. Mr. Chairman, I am a product of a tremendous, what I call AC-RC relationship down through the years. I have been a participant in and a beneficiary of that AC-RC relationship. And it's something that I take a great deal of pride in. And I know I speak a lot on behalf of Guard issues because that's a lot of my background. And General Odierno, you know that I have some deep concerns in the area of attack aviation and the proposed exchange, if you will, in the Black Hawk and Apache arena. I cannot argue a lot of the logic about the utility of the Black Hawk and its ability to better serve governors and adjutants general for some of their statewide missions. And so I applaud you for giving consideration to those missions. My concern, however, is taking the attack aviation piece completely out of the National Guard. And it creates a bit of a contentious debate between the AC and the RC components, but I just think it's flawed from a sense that we have taken some of our strategic depth out of the reserve component that we believe is a very important component of our ability to prosecute missions around the world. And so I need you to help me understand why we would make such a drastic exchange of that type.
Thank you, Congressman. First off, it's about the budget. The issue is we can no longer afford to sustain the amount of aircraft we have, so we have to eliminate obsolete aircraft. And it's centered around the OH-58. This proposal is cost avoidance of almost $12 billion because it would cost us about $10 billion to modernize the OH-58 for it to perform the mission. So what we have to do is we have to take existing Apaches and replace them to do the scout mission. We can't buy enough Apaches to have them do the mission both in the Guard and the Reserve. In the active and the Guard. And so we've had to make some difficult choices. So what we've tried to do is come up with an organization that allows us to respond to future threats with the active component while still keeping structure in the reserve component. As I mentioned in my comments, We're eliminating 3 complete aviation brigades out of the active component because we can't afford to keep them. We are not eliminating aviation brigades in the Guard. What we are doing is transferring the attack capability out of the Guard. We can't afford to keep it. If we kept the attack capability in the Guard, we'd have to eliminate 3 to 4 brigades out of the Guard in order to do that. I don't want to do that because I need the lift. In Afghanistan and Iraq, the combat aircraft that flew the most hours is the UH-60, by far. It is the centerpiece of everything we do. I need that capability in the Guard. I need that to be capable of coming forward. The other piece with the Apache is it's not about individual pilot proficiency. We can sustain that in the Guard. It is about the complexity of the air-ground integration that has to occur that just frankly takes long time to do. We don't have the training time. We will not in the future have the training time to sustain the right level of this integration that is necessary in the Guard. We do have the time to do it in the active component. And that's why we felt it would be better to move it to the active component. Again, if I had my choice and I had the dollars, I certainly would have kept it in the Guard, but we simply don't have that choice.
Well, so let me ask, as just a follow-up, and I know I'm going to run out of time, the wisdom of using the Apache helicopter, an attack helicopter, for a scout mission, and the wisdom of taking 100% of your capability out of the National Guard. I'm just simply suggesting that there is a better rebalance than the one that is proposed.
Again, I would say the rebalance would be eliminating more aviation brigades in the Guard. And I don't think that would also eliminate lift and CH-47s, and I don't think we can afford to do that as I look at our total mission set as we move forward.
Mr. Chairman, may I add one brief
Mr.
point?
Secretary,
And
it's my time, so go right ahead. And
Thank you,
I'm going
sir.
to go to Mr. Owens after
Okay.
Mr. Womack.
The gentleman from Arkansas is more than capable of making up his own mind, but the only thing I would say is I mentioned in my opening comments is not just Mr. Womack, but all of you consider this proposal. The money's gone. So if we're not allowed to do this, if that's the judgment of Congress, obviously we will follow that, but we have to find that $12 billion somewhere else, out of Hyde. That's a lot of money, that's a lot of end strength, that's a lot of readiness. So that's just part of the equation.
I appreciate the responses and the hard work of these gentlemen. Mr. Chairman, I do appreciate you yielding me the time.
Mr. Womack, Mr. Owens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here today. You mentioned in your opening comments about the national defense strategy and how you are, in effect, trying to match the resources that you have against that strategy. Makes ultimately good sense. What do you see as the threats that we're going to face over the next 3 to 5 years, and how would you prioritize those threats?
So what I would say is, as I look at the world today, we have the breaking down and unrest in the Middle East. We have Sunni and Shia conflict going on throughout the Middle East. We have governments, ungoverned territories in the Middle East, as well as North Africa and Central Africa that are great concerns where terrorism can use in order to, terrorist organizations can use in order to attack the United States. Those are grave concerns. I have grave concerns over the Korean Peninsula, the acts of the new leader of North Korea, some of the things he's done, such as he's done in the last week or so, launching missiles, provocatively launching missiles. So those are concerns. We obviously are somewhat concerned because of the economic necessity of Asia Pacific to the United States, some of the competition over the islands and with some of our close allies, the Japanese, and issues with China. So there are, and there's others, but those are the main ones that I'm concerned about. And the bottom line is, and then we have things that we're not, that pop up, such as what's happened over in Ukraine and the Crimea, where 90 days ago nobody would have been talking about that. And so it's these unknown issues that come up that also concern me that we have to be prepared to do. In my opinion, as we move forward, one of the most important things our military does is deter. And that we have to deter miscalculation and actions that others might do. And I think that's what we have to be concerned about. And deterrence is a combination of capability and capacity. And I think for us, it's important that we understand that as we move forward.
And if I'm interpreting your testimony correctly, you feel that at this point you do not have the maximum deterrent capacity that you need.
I think that if we have to go down to full sequestration, I believe it will be difficult. It will be come into question.
So absent the impact of sequestration in 16, you think you would be at your maximum deterrent capacity?
That's correct, sir.
Do I have a little more time?
A little more time, yes.
A little more time. I have a
And-
question
and
on
then Mr.
BRAC.
Kingston.
I have a question on BRAC. One of the things that we've seen the Army doing is some realignment without a BRAC. You've in fact moved some troops around. You obviously can't close a facility in the absence of a BRAC, but you can in fact move troops around. Is the plan to continue that process and the ultimate outcome being, if you will, the creation of a scenario in which it is now obvious which facilities you want to have closed?
Well, having gone through a BRAC that hit close to your hometown, Plattsburgh, you can never tell because Plattsburgh Air Force Base was closed in spite of the fact that the Air Force very much wanted to keep it. So it's not our intent to create a foregone conclusion. As you noted, we have made significant restructuring decisions largely because we had to draw down an end strength pursuant to budgets. Absent some further relief, that will continue, although I will tell you we're already scheduled to come down to 490 by the end of 15 and then from 490 to 440 to 450. So just by definition, as fewer troops are in those buildings, more and more space will become excess. We want to minimize that. Right now, we calculate we're paying about $500 million a year in what we call the empty facilities tax. You have to maintain buildings to a certain level even though you're not using them. But we will always stay within the law. We have prerogatives of certain things we can do with respect to structure that the Congress has provided us, and as we go forward, we'll try to use those. But an ultimate BRAC, which is the most efficient way, the most way in which we wisely spend taxpayers' dollars, in which we receive the most savings, is, in our judgment, the most sensible path to take. But we need your authorization to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Mr. Kingston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, General Odierno. It's great to see both of you. We certainly appreciate everything that you do and your friendships that you have developed here on the Hill. I wanted to follow up with Mr. Owens on that. Mr. Secretary, I think that's an important point. You're paying, you say, $500 million a year, $500 million a year to maintain buildings which you no longer need?
Correct.
And therefore, would it be more orderly to have a BRAC than to not have a BRAC? Because it seems like right now we're having a BRAC, it's just that it's a backdoor BRAC.
Well, without a BRAC, what we do is create more excess rather than fewer. We keep facilities, but there are no people in them. There's no use for those facilities, and yet we still have to maintain them, so it actually adds the process that we're going through right now of drawing down forces, our end strength, of creating more vacancies in our facilities, actually will drive that $500 million up. A BRAC would allow us to go about it in a far more sensible way, would allow us to make rational decisions so that we can concentrate our facility excess and to a great extent as possible get it off the books, saving us rather than costing us money.
Would it be possible to put a dollar amount on that?
Well, if you look at 2005, the department spent $6 billion as investment going in to execute the BRAC and are realizing $3 billion savings per year. Right now, we would estimate a BRAC would probably produce us about $1 billion in savings after a 7-year implementation period. That's a hand grenade estimate, obviously. We were precluded under the NDAA from even considering or planning for a BRAC, so we're not as, we don't have the fidelity on our estimates that we would like, but we think that's a reasonable estimate, and as we go forward, we'll certainly refine those estimates.
General Odierno, Mr. Owens had asked about troop strength, and we have the numbers in terms of not just the Guard, but the Reserve and the active duty. Do you think that puts us at peril going down to the troop levels that are proposed?
So at 440 to 450, 335, 195, I believe that's the floor that we can go to and meet the defense strategic guidance. And as I view the national security environment, I believe that's the lowest we should go to. Sequestration takes us to a much lower level, 420, 315, 185, and I believe we will not be able to meet our mission, and I believe it puts in question our ability to properly deter and to properly even conduct one long, prolonged, multi-phase campaign if necessary, and that's my concern.
Good. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Kingston. Ms. Capter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary and General Odierno, welcome. General Odierno, I first met you in Iraq, and I want to thank you for your service to our country in a most difficult assignment. And we're very honored with your presence today. I almost don't know where to start because I really want to ask you about your perspective on Iraq and the prospects for stability going forward, but I simply must ask this because of what has happened in Central Europe with the staging of Russian troops at both the Ukrainian and very proximate to the Moldovan border. And now we heard on the news this morning, Estonia, at the Estonian border, appears largely Army troops. I'm wondering if you have had a chance with your staff to observe what is going on and could put what is happening there in perspective for us. How significant is that staging by Russia?
Well, I would just say, first, we do watch it very carefully. I think it's, for us, it's something that we have to be very cognizant of. And us within the NATO context, I think NATO and the United States has to be very cognizant of what's going on and watch very carefully the troop deployments and the exercises that they are doing in Russia. So we have to watch it. We have to understand that some of these countries who we've begun to work with are concerned about this. We have some of our other NATO allies that are concerned about what they're seeing here, especially those in Eastern Europe. And I think it's important for us that we operate within the NATO framework to address these issues. And we are doing that. We are obviously reaching out to our counterparts. Obviously, the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe is working this very hard. But it is something that I think we all have to be watched very carefully and that we're all concerned with.
I want to just make an observation that it appears to me Ukraine was left defenseless over the last 2 decades. There have been some exercises that have occurred within her territory. There's been some engagement, but the last 2 decades appear to have allowed this moment to happen. And so I just wanted to state that for the record. I hope that whatever occurs in the future, that the border nations, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Hungary, even Turkey, Moldova, Romania, that a new architecture for participation in some manner to maintain an edge. There has to be some structure that that holds a line, and I'm sure that's being discussed, and I hope it continues. I would just ask you to consider It's my understanding there are some training exercises that were to occur in the western portion of Ukraine in June with several allies of the United States. I don't know, and not all of them, I believe, are members of NATO. However, I'm wondering if those training exercises might be moved up, or some aspect of them. I'm not aware of all training exercises, but it just seems to me to leave any country that wants to accede to Europe defenseless at this moment is not a good strategy. And I'm just wondering about the flexibility of exercises. And then I'd like to ask about supplies. Would, if Ukraine were to request supplies, would that be formally done through NATO? Where would supplies come from to Ukraine if she faced the worst?
So a couple things. I think we have a robust exercise program that goes on throughout Europe that could be utilized to do many things, to include what you suggest. And I think we're taking a very hard look at that as we look at the exercises that we have planned. You know, last year when we went through this for the first time, the United States has a brigade that's part of the NATO response force. And it's actually 1st Brigade of 1st Cavalry Division out of Fort Hood. And they have been training, and in fact they are prepared. They are supposed to conduct training exercises in Europe with NATO over the next several months. And so there are things that can be done. In terms of supplies, we are working several different courses of action, from non-lethal to lethal supplies that we could provide. It can be done through NATO. It could be done in a bilateral nature, depending on the decisions that are made. We are conducting assessments of the types of things we could do, and we are providing those to the joint staff for analysis.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, do I have time for one additional question? I just wanted to place on the record, if I could, that it has come to my attention, and I may have incorrect information, that within your budget, in the area of marksmanship and training of our personnel, both active and Guard and Reserve, that the funding for marksmanship has been reduced by about 60%. I don't know if that is a correct number. I represent a Camp Perry with the best shooting range in the country, and I would hope that if in fact there had been that type of serious cutback, you might take a look at the ability of our forces to train properly and to do what is necessary to provide them with those skills.
If I just give a quick answer, there's been no reduction in individual and squad level training and marksmanship. That's funded. Where we have problems when we get above that level, the collective training that happens at platoon, company, battalion, that's where we've had to reduce funding.
Thank you, Ms. Calvert. I think the record should also show, and I think it's true, General Odierno, that Ukraine has stood with us both in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we're highly appreciative and recognize their sacrifice. Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank both of you gentlemen for your terrific service to our country in a variety of capacities. And thank you in particular in both your testimony for being direct and blunt about the consequences of another sequester. You know, I think and I've said this on multiple occasions, but I'm going to keep saying it for the record, I think you and your counterparts in the other services are making tough decisions because we haven't, as a Congress and an administration, made our tough decisions. And I don't think anybody, when we first voted for the Budget Control Act, ever thought sequester would come a reality. Nobody did politically on either side. I don't think the services did, and we stumbled into a really bad situation that you're having to deal with. While I'm very proud that we found 2 years of relative budget certainty, you know, all we did was buy a little time. We're going to have exactly the same problem here. And I would suggest, I don't think anything's going to happen between now and November, but we need to make the tough decisions as soon after that as we possibly can, so you have the certainty that Mr. Womack appropriately said that we owe you. I've always been willing to vote for any deal that we could find that would do that. I'll do that again. But I do think some of our leadership on both sides of the aisle and sort of up the chain need to sit around the table and come to a deal. Otherwise, we're going to keep living this scenario, and it's just not it's not fair to the men and women that you both lead. Let me ask a couple quick questions, if I may. One, you represent Fort Sill. You're always interested in artillery. So very interested in your assessment of where we are in the PIM modernization program and how you see that unrolling.
Well, thank you for your comments, Mr. Cole, and obviously it's not important, I suppose, but we fully agree. As I know you and I have talked in the past, the Army is fully committed to PIM, and we recognize the impact to the great state of Oklahoma, but it is critically important to the Army. We need a new self-propelled artillery howitzer to keep up with our formations, and so we're going forward. We really have no particular challenges at this point. We're coming up to our first delivery of LRIPs, but we expect 66.5 vehicles sometime in mid-2015. And thereafter, we'll go to the first unit equipped at a full rate production decision planned for the second quarter of 17. You know, these are long timelines, they're frustrating, but when you're developing something as important as this, and really is a generational change at times, kind of an unavoidable factor.
Second, just quick follow-up, you know, and I know this causes everybody great deal. We've spent an awful lot of money in the pursuit of new cannons, whether it was the Crusader or the NLOC, part of the Future Combat System. We spent billions of dollars, never got a deployable system out of it. What are we doing? Number one, is there anything that was gained in the course of that work that can be salvaged technologically? And number two, what are we doing to make sure we don't walk down this road again, because we certainly can't afford to do it?
Thank you for bringing, I think there was, but I'm going to make the
question, let me
bringing up our painful past.
Cole, having defended a lot of those programs.
At least he didn't throw in Future Combat Systems and some of it. Oh, he did? I missed that. I had grown numb by the time he had gotten to that.
Repeat the question.
No, that's okay. Thank you, Tom. If you take, as we have, all of these non-deliverable developmental programs, you can learn a great deal, and we do think we have. And we've tried to employ those lessons learned of reaching too far for immature technologies, of writing requirements that are really more a pipe dream than a realistic path forward to acquisition. I do believe we have shown great improvement. The fact that the PIM at this point of maturity in low rate initial production is still on time and still on schedule, I think reflects indeed the fact of those lessons learned, and I think we can show it in other developmental programs as well. We spent a lot of time after the cancel of the NLOC and Crusader and those other things you mentioned, try to better understand where it was we seemed to repeatedly come up short. We had the Decker-Wagner report that I ordered to be held. It came back with 56 great recommendations. We've implemented the vast majority of those, and they are making a difference. And we watch these very, very closely, and every program manager knows that he or she are going to be judged by their staying in budget, on schedule, and are going to be judged by their ability to bring in that program to production.
Just one quick request, really. If it's possible, could I get a copy of that report?
Absolutely.
Frankly, it would be helpful for us to learn the same lessons.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you,
I could just quickly comment, and I'm just going to reinforce what the Secretary said, but we have moved some of the technologies into the PIM program. Now, probably not worth the investment that we made, but we have taken some of those technologies and integrated. Now, I would say one thing.
Used to be called the spiraling up.
Yes, yes.
I don't know what they call it now.
Spiraling out technologies. But the other thing I would say is, and the Secretary mentioned it, it is about requirements, and it's about our requirements process. We have put in a lot of work on ensuring we have adjusted our requirements process in the Army, and we're constantly, because what happens is we built requirements on hoping for technology, instead of building requirements on technology that was achievable. And that's what we're changing. And you got to build requirements that are achievable. And if we build them that aren't achievable, it leads us down this road. And you got to constantly assess it, adjust it, take a look at it. And we now, I believe, have processes in place that allow us to do that.
Let's
Thank
hope
you.
so.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me first, just as I look at the numbers here, I know we've had a couple questions already on the end strength, and you look at the sequester numbers, what the potential possibilities could be. Just want to encourage you as publicly and as loudly as you can to continue to get this message out and amplify it. I think this is a situation that would be completely unacceptable from the committee's perspective, and I know it is from yours as well. My fear is that this hasn't really penetrated the thoughts of average Americans as what this would mean for us. And you've mentioned, General, that this is mostly about deterrence. To Mr. Owen's question, this is mostly about deterrence. And so to look at these numbers and to imagine a world in 2018, 2019 is unacceptable, I think, to most of us here. So if you can continue to help us out in the public to drive that message, I think it'd be critically important. You mentioned BRAC, and the Navy was here yesterday, and they mentioned BRAC as well. As you know, Mr. Secretary, it's not the favorite phrase to hear as a member of Congress. And so just a question, I know we had some discussions from previous BRACs at how much it cost to actually implement the BRAC process. And there were a lot of complaints of how expensive it was to implement BRAC. I think it was $35 billion in some of the estimates that I looked at. Can you talk a little bit about how a new BRAC would be different, or is that standard? The assumption was it was going to cost like $21 billion to implement, and it ended up being $35 billion. And in these tough times, I think this is a fair question for us to ask: how much money would we be asked to put up front, and what would the estimated savings be on the back end?
Well, that's an absolutely important and appropriate question. The $35 billion was a department-wide, as you noted, department-wide investment for the 2005 round. If you look at from the Army's side of it, the 2005 round was really two BRACs in one. We had really what we call an efficiency BRAC, to the extent that it largely entailed moving troops around, relocating headquarters, trying to place programs and processes in one location to gain efficiencies. That takes a lot longer to pay back, and because the MILCON costs are so high, because we're creating new structure, that would be considered an unusually expensive BRAC for the Army. The second piece was the more traditional closures, save money, fewer facilities. And we're saving right now from the 2005 as an Army about $1 billion a year, each and every year. So we think even at that high price tag, unusually so in 05, for the Army, again, we don't expect our costs going in would be anywhere near the 2005, although, as I commented earlier, because of previous prohibitions on our ability to actually do analysis related to BRAC, that's now been lifted. We don't have the kind of clarity, the kind of numbers, I think, that you would want, and we understand that. We're going to try to work to get those to you. Our rule of thumb, about a 7.7% rate of return on investment for the Army. That would be our goal after 7 years. We've made that, to my understanding, in virtually every previous BRAC, and we think that'd be a more than reasonable expected rate of return.
Which is about that over previous BRACs?
Yes, sir.
You've hit that number?
Right.
If I could, I would just add that the last BRAC, there was really some significant reorganization that went on in the Army. For example, we consolidated the Maneuver Center of Excellence, Fort Benning and Fort Knox consolidated. We consolidated all our combat service support at Fort Lee. We consolidated maneuver support at Fort Leonard Wood. Those were major changes. That's not what this BRAC would be about. We've done that, and that's been very successful. This one is more about excess infrastructure. In other words, it's just that we have to get rid of some of the excess infrastructure, and we can't afford to pay it. So I think, based on that, the expense would not be as great because we had to build new facilities as we combined facilities at Fort Benning and at Fort Lee and at Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri. So it was probably a bit higher. I think this one would be quite a bit different because it's really about eliminating infrastructure we just can't afford to have because of the reduction in the size of the Army.
Okay. Right. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Mr.
You'll
Chairman.
get another bite at the apple,
All right.
depending on time here. Judge
you for
Carter,
your
thank you for your
generosity.
patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see both of you. Mr. Secretary, I believe we met first and got to know each other on a trip to Iraq. And General Odierno, we met you in Iraq. So there's some relationship there. I don't know what it is. I've since gotten to know you at Fort Hood. I want to ask a question that still is relevant to what we're talking about. As I understand it, we will not receive the fiscal year of 2015 Overseas Contingency Operations, OCO budget, until after the Afghanistan Enduring Presence decision has been made. The Army has said it will need OCO dollars for years after operations in Afghanistan draw down, both to get our equipment out of the theater and into depots so that the equipment may be retrograded and reset. The Army has $9.9 billion of reset requirements alone that are directly attributable to this war effort. In addition, OCO provides funding for global war of terror operations happening in CENTCOM area of responsibility, but not necessarily Afghanistan. Secretary McHugh, what is the Army's long-term plan to fund equipment resets and retrograde? Will you request funding for the Army and OCO in FY 2015 or in the out years? What impact would the loss of OCO funding have on the Army's retrograde and reset? And what impact would it have on the Army readiness? And General Odierno, with the problems I understand that when we are moving things out of Afghanistan, a great deal of that is to go the northern route because of issues we've had with Pakistan, and therefore I assume that would involve Russia in some form or fashion. With what's going on in the unrest in Russia, do you see that the northern route out being an issue as we take our equipment out?
Thank you, Congressman. Our intent has always been, and our need has been and remains, that OCO funding continue for 3 years after cessation of hostilities, after withdrawal out of Afghanistan. And the vast, vast majority of those funds are intended to do the reset that you mentioned. As we sit here this morning, we have probably about $10 billion worth of equipment in Afghanistan that we intend to retrograde back to the United States to reset and to return to our troops. And if we lose that money, we'll have junk piles next to our arsenals, next to our depots, particularly, because we won't have the funds to process those. That has multiple effects, none of them good. First of all, the workload, the people needed at those depots will go down. That's a real impact on the economy. It is an added concern for us as we struggle to find ways to sustain our organic industrial base. It also means that those pieces of equipment vital to our formations, vital to keeping our equipment on hand and our modernization ratings up and sufficiently high, would not get back to those troops. It would just be unavailable. That means readiness declines even further. So regardless of what perspective you take on this issue, if we fail to get that funding, we have an enormous problem that I just don't see us fixing in less than a decade, if then. We do intend to ask for funds in 2015. The problem that I recognize is challenging for this committee, particularly this subcommittee, is that without hard numbers, it's hard to write a bill. The administration's asked for a place marker. We obviously will look to you to...
Not only if the gentleman will yield, not only to write a bill, defend a bill. We need to
no argument. I've been there, seen it. I never served on this great committee, but I begged you for things over many years.
We work very closely with our authorizers, too, former Mr. Chairman.
So, yeah, if you look at last year, the Army's portion of the OCO bill was about $46 billion. We're coming out. We expect it would be something less than that, but we owe you the numbers as quickly as we can get them. But as you noted, Judge, we've got the issue of the Afghan elections and the Afghan SOFA.
Thank you, Judge Carter. Mr. Sklasky.
Could I get the answer to the northern route?
Very briefly, northern route, I know we're not using as much as we originally intended. Is that correct?
That's great. It has not been affected. We are using it, but we have course of action in case we don't have to use it. I know you're...
Expensive.
Yeah, it's expensive. Could I just make a short comment on OCO?
Go right ahead.
On the OCO, we understand we have a problem. The Army has a really specific problem, even for 15, because October, November, December, we know for sure we're still in Afghanistan. We've got to pay for October, November, December. In addition to that, all of our end strength over 490 is in OCO, and we don't get to 490 till the end of 15. So we already have a bill that we know, even if regardless of what the outcome is in Afghanistan. So we have to work this very carefully because it would have significant impact on our budget. The other piece to this is we also have about $5 billion we estimate that has to go from OCO to base if we continue to do some of our contingency operations that are being paid by OCO. And so there are a lot of issues involved with this that we're going to have to deal with in 15 and the out years with OCO, and it could have a significant impact on our base budget.
Excellent point and important to have in the record. Thank you.
If we have to fly everything out, which if the GLOCs go down, we would, that's a $3 billion estimate. The least expensive using GLOCs is $1 billion, so it's big money.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General, just following up on your remarks, and we've had some extended conversation on OCO, you hit a point, and that is no matter what happens, we're there for 3 more months. And again, the Chairman's opening remarks and mine, should we expect from the administration shortly some details for at least those 3 months for our anticipated bill?
We're having discussions right now internally on this. We understand the importance of it, and we are having discussions on this now.
I'd like to follow up, as always, Mr. Cole is ahead of me. I have a terrific question that he has already asked, thanks to our wonderful staff. But I would follow up on that in all seriousness about the issue of acquisition in programs. Relative to some of these large programs, ground combat vehicle, the future combat system, just to name a couple, as we proceed, 2 questions on my mind. One is, what are our risks of obsolescence? And understanding that the Army is always trying to upgrade what we do have, and circumstances change. What's the difficulty we're seeing here in the industrial base? Because at some point you still keep that base alive as you upgrade. But at some point, if you don't have some significant production, I'm very concerned about that.
Well, it's very important. And although we focus a lot of time on our external industrial base, as we should, it's not often that people think about what we do and our modernization programs in terms of supporting the general economy. And when we have to, as we already have, taken significant cuts out of our modernization programs, out of our developmental programs, and GCV is a perfect example. GCV was performing. The program was on schedule. It was on budget for the internals of the initiative, but we simply couldn't afford it in light of other realities. So that results in potential loss of jobs. Those are programs that go away. And so as we look across our portfolio, we try to do the best we can identifying particular points of failure. In other words, where we have suppliers or we have high-skilled manufacturing personnel, and try to make adjustments where possible so that we continue to support them at least at a minimum sustainment rate so that when larger programs come about and we're in full rate production of something else that they can build, they can return to full health. But it's a challenge. We don't have enough money to do the things we need to do to begin with.
Any particular discrete areas of the industrial base, if you would, that you're most concerned about? And again, the issue of obsolescence that
well, we've got a number of studies and analysis ongoing. One, the S2T2 sector by sector, tier by tier analysis conducted by the Department of Defense, and as well as internally to the Army. We're studying our organic industrial base, particular points of vulnerability, and we have an ongoing A.T. Kearney study that will finish its first phase, and the report will be ready probably by the end of next month, and then enters a second phase. And most of those are trying to identify two particular areas. First, where are those truly high-skilled, close to irreplaceable workers? We're not talking about folks who come and go, and folks we are able to hire off the economy pretty readily, but those folks that have particular skills. And second of all, where are those, and they're usually lower down on the chain of acquisition, single points of failure, and they generally lie in pretty specialized manufacturers. And we've made some adjustments in our FLIR, our forward-looking infrared radars, and in some transmission components for our combat fleet, to try to protect those kinds of things. But again, it comes back to you can only protect as many as you have money to spend.
I mean, we are working very hard. Let me use the ground combat field as an example. Is how do we sustain the intellectual base of our combat development programs in industry? And so we are working to make sure that we have the dollars to do that, because if we lose that, then as we move down the road, we really have problems in developing these programs. So we are looking to put some monies in this process so they can sustain a level of intellectual capacity to move forward as we look down the road to develop a future, for example, infantry fighting vehicle. And we have to do that in several areas, and we're trying to balance that in order so that we can sustain that, because if we don't, we have real problems.
Mr. Chairman, if I could ask one more question, please. On women in combat, Secretary Panetta had a memorandum in January of last year and would note that in 2012 the Army has already opened up 14,000 positions that had previously been closed to women. One of the issues, obviously, is the issue of physical standards, and as I understand it, and had a very good conversation with a number of people yesterday, it's not necessarily having the same standards, but making sure that the outcome you need for that particular skill set is met, and there might be different techniques to get to that outcome. I guess the question I would have is, has DOD, in this case the Department of the Army, taken steps to more clearly define what those physical standards might be? And secondly, how are we proceeding? And again, recognizing that the Army is making significant progress here.
Yeah, so there's two things. So the Training and Doctrine Command has undertaken a physical demand study, and that's in coordination with the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine and other outside organizations. And they are conducting valid, safe, legally defensible physical performance tests. We're out doing it now. We just finished one at Fort Stewart, Georgia, where we're doing these tests in order to define what are the capabilities, physical capabilities are necessary to accomplish specific MOSs. And it is regardless of gender.
Sex, yeah.
So it's really important that we do this. The other thing we're doing is a gender integration study. And what we're doing is, they're conducting the cultural and institutional factors that would ensure that we set the environment for successful gender integration in the MOSs that previously women have not been serving. And so with those two efforts, we believe we're really making a lot of progress, and we're very confident in how we're moving forward right now.
May I make a comment, Mr. Chairman? Yes. I think it's important everybody recognize that the discussion that somehow we're lowering standards to allow women to enter is simply untrue.
Right.
We have been told by the folks who are in a position to know that when we get through this exercise that the chief laid out and match physical requirements to skills required, there are going to be some men who probably for some time have been in those MOSs who are not going to be able to qualify anymore. This is about making sure we are maximizing every soldier to have a job that he or she is most likely to succeed in, and ensuring that we have soldiers who are less likely to get injured, who can perform at higher standards. And we're going about this in a very, very deliberate way. So while we're working very hard to open positions for women, right now we've got a notice from DOD to the Congress that for the Army will open 33,000 additional positions. This is much wider than just women in the Army. This is about giving every soldier a better opportunity for success.
Well, I appreciate your seriousness about this issue and all of the good work and progress you have made today very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair would like to claim some time before I recognize Ms. Lowy. When I was in the coffee line this morning, somebody said, are you going to mix it up with the Secretary and the Army Chief? And I said, well, first of all, they're good friends and they do a remarkable job. They provide a lot of leadership, and you've been given some pats on the back and accolades for being blunt about the sequester. But the other part of that equation is that, and I suppose I direct this to you as a civilian leader, there has been a decision to get off what we call permanent war footing. In other words, to me, as someone on this committee who's been here for a while, we started the process being able to be involved in 2 wars at the same time, and General Odierno has suggested that we could perhaps address one for a limited period of time. So we have good reason in some ways to continue to be on war footing. I mean, there was a time a couple of months ago when the House was challenged that we were going to sort of take some military action in Korea, and there was a sort of a back off from that, which I think surprised a lot of people, disappointed some of our allies. The Koreans aren't slowing down their hostility. The Chinese are setting up sort of an exclusion zone. We talked about this in another setting over the last 24 hours, and they are being confrontational. And there is the issue that our adversaries are watching, our allies are watching what our response is. After all, this is a defense posture hearing here. We can wring our hands about the state of what's going on here in terms of the sequester and continuing resolution, but you still have a job to do here. And I don't know whether this is the forum, but this is the committee that's going to come up with with whatever it takes you to get across the finish line. I think we continue to live in a very dangerous world here. Who would have thought that the Russians would have annexed Crimea? We can go back into the history. We can talk about gulags and things that all these people have suffered, their indignities and the horrors. But we need to be prepared for every eventuality. And I know this is sort of sequester-centric here, but in reality, we now have a we're taking ourselves off a permanent war footing. I think we live in a more dangerous world, and we need to be prepared for that. So the bottom line here, are we prepared? Are we prepared? It's an issue of readiness here. Whatever the number is, are we ready to meet whatever those challenges are, that some of which I've outlined?
Well, really important subject. And what keeps me up at night is our readiness today. That's what keeps me up at night. I mentioned earlier we have 70,000 soldiers currently that are on operational commitments around the world. That's a significant number. And what's happened is in 2013 we had a really significant downgrade in our readiness because of the hammer of sequestration. The bipartisan budget agreement helped us significantly in 2014. It helps us a little bit in 2015. So we're starting to rebuild this readiness. The problem is, if you go back to sequestration in 2016, you fall off the cliff, readiness cliff. So once again, we're going to have readiness issues because of the nature of sequestration. So in order to sustain appropriate readiness, it's got to be consistent funding over consistent periods of time, because readiness is something that comes and goes. If you're not constantly preparing yourself, you lose readiness. And I worry we're having too many fits and starts with readiness. We're taking advantage of the money that you've given us on the bipartisan budget agreement, and we're now building readiness. But that ends, in 15, and so we have this problem. The only other thing I would say is counterintuitive. What people don't realize, as you get smaller, readiness is more important.
Exactly my question.
Yeah.
Whatever your size is, you better be capable of moving it quickly. It's a subject which is key to our thing, and this is a group that all endorses, regular order. We've got the ranking member here, Ms. Lowy. I mean, there's been a working relationship with Chairman Rogers. I'm not sure everybody outside our committee gets it, but we're still working on it. Leader Lowy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure for me to join you in welcoming the Secretary. Nice to see you in this position, and General Odierno. I know that I have been involved, I know you are, in the Wounded Warrior Project, and I know how much you care and you're working to address that very, very serious issue when these young men and women come home. I want to thank you and all the Army soldiers and civilians for your sacrifices and dedication to keeping our nation safe. The Army faces great funding shortfalls due to sequestration, and while a partial restoration of funds in the fiscal year 2014 budget will help recoup some of the lost readiness, tough choices remain in the Army's budget proposal for fiscal year 15 and beyond. With today's volatile environment, it is increasingly difficult to most effectively shape the Army for the future. And we need to work together to ensure this budget allows the Army to meet our national security goals despite uncertainty and fiscal constraint. And I look forward to doing just that, Mr. Chairman. Sexual assault and harassment continues to plague the military. The President gave the Department of Defense a deadline of December 1st, 2014 to evaluate whether changes implemented over the past 12 to 18 months are making a difference. The Pentagon reported that about 5,400 instances of sexual assault or unwanted sexual contact were reported in the military in FY 2013, a 60% rise from 2012. Last month, the top Army prosecutor for sexual assault was suspended after allegations that he sexually harassed a subordinate. Just this week, an Army general officer got off with merely a hand slap after being charged with similarly egregious offenses. General Odierno, do you believe the Army will be able to stem the rising incidence of sexual assaults or unwanted contact? Is it a cultural problem? Is it a leadership problem? Will opening more military positions to women at all ranks help the problem?
First off, I think there's several things we have to do. One is we have to constantly work on our culture. And we're working that from the bottom up and the top down, and it's absolutely critical. It is also, anything that goes on in the Army is a leader issue. And this is about leaders being involved at every level to solve this problem. We have made it our #1 priority. I hold regular meetings with our leaders. I talk to every brigade and battalion commander. I'm talking to every one of our generals about their responsibilities, our sergeant majors. And that is, in our institutions, we are changing how we train. So all of this is absolutely critical to us as we go forward. Yes, we can solve this problem, but we have a lot of work to do yet. We are seeing some things that I think, our prosecution rates are up. Number of people going to trial is up. So there's some positive signs. I also believe The reason the rates have gone up in terms of the number of incidents is because they feel much more comfortable coming forward because of the new renewed involvement in the chain of command, and that they're gaining some confidence. But we still have much work to do. We're near where we need to be yet, but we are absolutely focused on this.
If you could describe for us the DoD Military Criminal Investigative Organization, the MCIOs, to investigate 100% of sexual assault cases. What impact will this have on the Army, and how has the Criminal Investigation Division been resourced, both funding and manning, to meet this growing requirement?
There are two things that we've done. We have, first of all, I think we're recognized as having the best forensics capability of any of the services in terms of sexual assault within the Criminal Investigation Division of the U.S. Army, because we've invested a lot of dollars in that. We continue to increase the number of special prosecutors that we are training with experience in this area. We're also increasing the number of investigators and giving them very specific training to ensure they understand how to investigate these crimes. And we're continuing to increase this. We're also have an awareness campaign that commanders understand the capabilities of the Criminal Investigation Division, both the special prosecutors as well as the investigators. We continue to increase in all of these areas, and we are continuing to invest. I just went down to Fort Leonard Wood, where we have our school, and I spent time there. We've also implemented new courses in the school. We've also established a new Army-level school for SARCs. And so we are investing a lot of money in this, and we will continue to do so.
And one other question, if I may. The issue of suicide prevention remains a high priority, I know, within the Department of Defense. While Army suicides in all three components have declined in recent years, from 325 in 2012, 305 in 2013, 53 reported thus far in 2014, it remains a problem, and it really pains all of us to look at those numbers. General Odierno, do you believe the Army is doing a better job of addressing this issue with soldiers, and what has made the difference, what still needs to be done? It is so painful for us to think this exists after our young men and women serve with such distinction. If you could address that.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. For two areas I'll highlight quickly. One is we've expanded behavioral health significantly in the Army. We have increased behavioral health staff by 150% since 2013, and we're now in the units. We now have behavioral health specialists down to brigade level. This is having a significant impact on so they have people that can get to, and they're more access to the care that they need. The other thing I would say is that it's about us also, our Ready Resilient campaign, where we're focusing on Ready Resilient soldiers and families and the education of them in terms of modification of their behavior, a better physical, better mental toughness and strength, the ability to cope with very difficult situations. And we're getting great feedback from our soldiers and families that this is starting to make a difference. Again, this is one that requires leadership attention. This is one that we will not stop. When we lose it, no matter what, however we lose a soldier, it's very difficult for us, and we continue to work this very carefully.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms.
Chairman.
Lowy. Let me just correct the record. I was referring earlier to Syria, the potential military action there. We obviously hope never to see such a thing happen on the Korean Peninsula. Mr. Crenshaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to pick up a little bit on what the chairman just talked about in terms of readiness. And when I walked in, Mr. Sklasky was talking about the industrial base. And I want to ask a couple, we've had this ongoing conversation about tanks. And I actually just came for a meeting with Condoleezza Rice, and we were talking about Ukraine, talking about Russia, talking about Georgia, talking about NATO. And one of the things that she commented on, maybe we were a little premature in thinking everything is going in the right direction. And when you talk about tanks, I know there was a time 3, 5 years ago, said we don't need any more tanks for now, but we might need them 5 years later. And so we had a discussion about what happened if you shut down a production facility and then had to start it back up. And there was a back and forth about how much that might cost, somewhere $500 million to $1 billion, $500 billion to $1 billion. And the last several years, this subcommittee, we have to take like a long view of the world. I know sometimes your decisions can be driven on a short-term basis, but we provided somewhat of a safety net to make sure that the only tank production and modernization facility we have stayed open, along with some foreign military sales. And each year, you've chosen not to put any money in your request but we kind of provided that safety net. And so once again, here we are. We look at the request, and I think your view is that hopefully foreign military sales will keep the line sustainable. And as the world seems to get a little more dangerous, tanks probably become more important than they might have been 5 years ago in terms of modernization. And I guess the question is, if we didn't provide a safety net and the foreign military sales weren't what we all hoped they would be, what would happen to that only tank production facility we have in the country? And if it were to shut down, how much would it cost the Army, the military, to start it back up either next year or the year after that? And that's not in the budget. So talk about that and how you view the whole readiness issue, the industrial base issue, because I think we all agree how important it is, but it seems like that is an overall cost of doing business.
If I could, Mr. Krish, I'll start and then let the Chief take over. As I mentioned earlier, we spend a whole lot of time trying to analyze what we are able to do to sustain both the organic as well as the external industrial base. In the case of our combat fleet, we have in fact done some things to try to stretch out procurement times to sustain a minimum amount of work necessary to retain the skilled workers, which is our focus. We can't possibly maintain an entire workload as it was at the height of production, but we want to keep those skilled workers. We've made some accelerated acquisition, I mentioned earlier, in FLIR, our forward-looking infrared radars, some engine transmissions for the Bradley and other units to try to ensure that those skilled workforces stay available. And we have accelerated, with respect to the Abrams, we've accelerated our plan for the engineering upgrades, originally planned in 19. We've accelerated that to 17. We had, and you mentioned, a shutdown to warm status analysis that showed us that doing that kind of action and then a restart was far more cost efficient than sustaining and buying product that we don't need. We will have met the full Army acquisition requirement for Abrams tanks by next year, 15. It will be what it already is one of the most modern articles in the United States Army's inventory. The average Abrams tank is 4 to 5 years old right now. So do we wish we had money to continue to buy and build up a reserve? I suppose that would be nice, but in the current budget realities, we just don't have that capacity.
If I could just add, we have the most modernized and new tank fleet that we've ever had since I've been in the Army today, and that's because of the investments that you've allowed us to make. And so I feel comfortable with where we are with our tank fleet. We have not ignored it. We have capacity. We have capability. So we have that capability. The issue is, as the Secretary said, is how do we sustain an industrial base for the long term? And I think we've tried to come up with the best strategy possible to do that. And so I feel comfortable with where we are with that. I feel comfortable with where we are with our tank fleet. Again, I believe we have the best tank in the world, and I believe we have the most, and it's been modernized to the extent that we have the fleet age of our tanks are the slowest they've ever been. And so I feel comfortable with where we are with that. We certainly are concerned with sustaining an industrial base that can continue to support us in the long term.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Crenshaw. Ms. McCullum and then Ms. Granger.
Thank you. I have two questions, and I really would like to get to them both. One builds off of what Mr. Crenshaw was talking about. There's been a lot of discussion about weapons systems and protecting those, and making sure that we have what the Navy needs in order to carry out its mission, the Air Force, the Army, the Marine Corps, and a lot of it's heavy equipment. But one thing I see when I'm out in the field, and one thing that's issued to just about everybody in the military, is body armor. And so I'm concerned from conversations that I've had from our soldiers and as well as with some of the medical personnel that I've spoken with, that some of the body armor was so heavy, and what we were asking our soldiers and Marines and others, you know, to carry around with them was really causing a lot of stress on their bodies. So I understand that the Army was really pursuing to work towards better body armor. I'm also aware that there's a shelf life with a lot of the body armor, and there's a report coming out shortly. So here's my question. What are you doing, because of what's in the budget for body armor, one, to make sure we don't lose the ability to continue the R&D on it, that we don't find ourselves in a position where we've outlived shelf life and all of a sudden we're scrambling for body armor. I mean, I think it's important that, you know, the industrial base, we think of the big ticket items, but the industrial base also includes R&D for the smaller ticket items, the items that are, you know, intimately responsible for protecting that soldier or Marine.
If I could start, Ms. McCollum, the body armor in terms of weight is a very significant aspect, but it's only one aspect. We're working across all the personal protection and personal equipment arenas to try to lighten the load. Everything from batteries. For a 3-day patrol, we've lightened the battery weight by 30%, and on and on and on.
Mr. Secretary, I really
sure.
want to be respectful, but I have another question that's very,
Sure.
very important to me. If you could just address body armor for me, please.
We have a acquisition objective to reduce further procurements of body armor by up to 20%. We have already reduced body armor through carrier plates and other systems by some 10%, but every day we're trying to do what we can to squeeze out weight.
And what is the shelf life on the body armor? Is there a report coming out?
I do believe there's an analysis. I haven't seen it, so I can't tell you what it says.
And do you know what happens to the R&D and some of the things that are going into the, I'm going to call it the industrial base for body armor, when the requisitions go down so low, especially when we don't know what the shelf life report's going to say?
Yeah, if I could, we do have a soldier protective system, which is the body armor system for the future, and that's our line to get the R&D and continue to move forward with new developments in our body armor program. And that is ongoing, and it looks at all aspects of the body armor, eye, torso, et cetera. And we're also looking at different types of body armor for different missions, because that also reduces the weight. And so that's all part of this future program that's being worked. Again, I have to look at the report as well.
Okay, well, we'll get back to you. I want to go back to the issue of sexual assault. Army General Sinclair just recently received a fine in no time. When he was first charged, it could have meant life in prison. My understanding, and I could read from a report in the Washington Post here, that after 2 years, all of a sudden, all the charges were dropped. What I have been led to believe is that General Sinclair had originally been willing to and admitting to charges which would have had consequences of jail time and consequences of losing rank and possibly losing pension. When that was discussed higher up the chain, it was told, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go to trial. Even though, and I have it on fairly good authority, that this was an agreement that the general had agreed to. We have been asked to trust the chain of command. I watched very carefully what was going on in the Senate. Can you tell me whether or not Admiral Sinclair had agreed to do jail time and had agreed to accept charges, and then the chain of command said, we don't want to do that?
I'm the civilian authority that has to make final determination on this and all similar disciplinary cases. Given that this is and remains an open case, unlike in the civilian sector when a jury renders its verdict and the judge issues sentencing, there still are several significant steps in the military process that have to occur. So we're greatly constrained at this point as to what we can say. I can say this, I'm not sure where you got your information that charges were dropped, but obviously they weren't dropped. They were the decision to prosecute, and in fact he was convicted. The issue, as I understand it, that arises was the judge's decision for sentencing. As in the civilian sector, the Army has no control over what an independent judiciary does or doesn't do with respect to sentencing.
To your knowledge, General Sinclair was never willing to plead guilty to any of the charges earlier and was directed or told that he should not accept that and that it should go to court.
To my knowledge, I'm not in a position to speak as to the procedure of the trial. The trial record is still open.
I'm not talking about the trial, sir. I'm talking about
it is all part of the record, Congresswoman, and I'm not. And I'm sorry. I wished I could, but I'm not in a position to comment on that. I can tell you that this officer, when he was accused, the investigation was properly begun. There was a decision to charge him. He was charged, he was prosecuted, and he was convicted. That's what I'm at liberty to say. I have the final determination authority as to his conditions of retirement, meaning his grade of retirement, and that matter has not yet reached my desk.
And I can understand you can't talk about that any farther. Thank you very much, and I think I made my point to my committee members.
Thank you, Ms. McCollum. Ms. Granger.
Secretary McHugh, less than a year ago, May of 2013, the Army opposed purchasing additional Lakota helicopters, stating that there was no emergency requirements that existed and that the Lakota was not designed for combat. I've been advised that you're planning to now purchase 100 new Lakotas and moving 100 existing Lakotas into the training command. The requirements generation process that led you to replace the existing TH-67 Creek trainers with Lakotas is unclear to me. Was there a study done? And if was, what did the study say?
There was an analysis done that resulted in a report that we call ARI, the Army Reconstruction Initiative, Reconfiguration Initiative, that seeks to realign and make new decisions on the entire Army portfolio. As we discussed earlier, one of the keystones of that is having the Army totally divest itself of Kiowa warriors. That has been an integral part of our attack platforms for many, many years, but it's no longer affordable. And instead to use Apache platforms, particularly in the active component, as a measure, frankly, to save money, some $12 billion. The decision on the training base was an underpinning of those other decisions and was led in part to the decision that you mentioned on the acquisition of 100 additional Lakotas for training purposes.
Can we get a copy of that, of the ARI? Do we have a copy of the ARI?
It's really a proposal. Do we have full analysis? Maybe the chief.
We have a proposal. We can provide you some backup data on why we made some of these decisions. We'll do that, ma'am.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Granger, I know we have a second round here. I'm trying to make sure it's even Steven here. Is there any indication on my left if there's someone who'd like to pose a question? Ms. Capter, and then we'll go to Mr. Cole or Mr. Crenshaw or Judge Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate my statement today with Congressman Crenshaw of Florida on the importance of a very robust force and overground capacity, particularly in tanks, and not knowing what the future will bring. I wanted to also ask Secretary McHugh, as you consider shipment back to the United States of equipment, used equipment from theater, I would hope that you would look at all 4 coasts equally. And if you need additional authority to use the Great Lakes, I would hope that you let me know that, because in the past, a lot has not come back through the lakes, even though we have a very high enlistment rate. And if there is not sufficient authority to use all 4 coasts, I hope that you will let me know that. We'll try to fix it if you don't have the authority, and that also there be an aggressive effort made by the Department of Defense to look at organizations stateside that need help. Our state veterans homes, for one, everything from beds to kitchen equipment, etc. Our homeless veteran shelters, not-for-profits in some of the lowest income communities in our country that need kitchen equipment, etc. So I just wanted to sensitize you to 4 coasts and allowing people who need equipment to be aware that it is being offered.
I saw your neighbor on your right-hand side, also your neighbor on the Great Lakes, perk up at that, having represented a Great Lakes district and a St. Lawrence River Seaway district for 17 years. I understand your concern and interest. I will advise Transcom, Transportation Command, of your very gracious offer. They're interested in doing it in the most cost-effective way possible, obviously. As to the equipment disposal, there is a federal process whereby we are required to offer excess articles to certain non-governmental and governmental agencies. A lot of the kinds of things that you mentioned are frankly far too expensive to bring back. They cost more to bring back than they cost to buy new. So I'm not sure how many of those articles would be available, but if they are brought back as excess, we do have a way by which we make those available.
All right, very good. Well, I think we have some interest. So thank you very much. I wanted to also just state for the record, and this relates to defense medicine and the condition of our soldiers in terms of suicide, alcohol, and PTSD. Through work that the department has done with Case Western Reserve and our Army Guard in Ohio, we've learned some very important things. One of the most important is, in terms of suicide, that the correlation between alcohol abuse descending into suicide is direct and significant. And I don't want to spend my time today talking about alcohol abuse, but I'm sure you know this, but I just wanted to place it on the table and hope that the department would do everything possible to identify alcohol abuse and to intervene at that level initially in order to make a difference on the suicide, on the numbers. And I know you've already done it. Yes, Mr.
Very, very quickly. Absolutely true, and we've seen that in our analysis as well, and I think the other services would agree. And we'd love to have the opportunity to have some folks come over and talk to you about, I think, one of the revolutionary programs the Army has initiated, and I've authorized to go Army-wide, called CONTREAT, where we encourage soldiers with those kinds of problems to self-report before they get into trouble, to go through treatment, and to have absolutely no negative effect to their record.
And their buddies can help a lot, too.
Absolutely.
If the gentleman
Would you yield one?
I'd be happy to yield to the
Because she mentioned she'd like to associate herself with remarks, and with all due respect, the question I asked didn't really get answered. I know the chairman wanted to move on, but this whole question of, you're going to build more and modernize tanks in 2016, and if there are not enough military sales this year, and there's no safety net that we provide as Congress, how much is that going to cost when you decide you're going to start building tanks again? And do you build that in? And that's the question.
Well, that will be a rhetorical question, but we would like to have
we can provide. We have the analysis, as I think Mr. Crenshaw.
You said the initial analysis. You said it would be better to go ahead and shut down the line for 5 years, and we argued about whether that cost $1 billion or not. But you had an analysis that said that's a good way to do it. we thought it would be better to get something for our money, and that's what we've been doing. Now, if you're telling me now you have a report that says shut down the line for a year, and that's still a better way to do the business than actually have some money in budget this year to kind of make sure it stays open, is that what you're saying?
The analysis I mentioned didn't really deal in 5 versus 3. It dealt with what does it cost to shut a line down and then reopen it, whether it's 1
year,
2, or
5
3.
years?
Yes, sir.
So if it cost $1 billion for a year, that's still a better use of taxpayer dollars?
That has been our analysis when we meet our acquisition objective, and the minimum sustainment rate for the manufacture of tanks is 12 a month. We're talking billions of dollars that we simply don't have to spend on something we don't need, is our point.
Ms. Capter reclaims her time for 15 seconds, then we go to Mr. Cole.
Mr. Chairman. I wanted to place important information on the record relating to PTSD. And we in Ohio have been very involved with the department in doing a longitudinal study of over 3,000 Ohio Guard members upon return, especially from Iraq and Afghanistan. And here's what we found. 50% of soldiers were entirely resistant. The other half had various levels of symptoms. 36% had mild symptoms, 11% chronic, mild, and persistent, and 3% very debilitating. But what we learned was that if more attention was paid at the enlistment level to the following factors, we could identify the most susceptible, and these are the categories. Those enlistees who come from families with less than $40,000 in income, who have an education of high school, GED or less, who have who've had more than 10 traumatic experiences prior to enlistment in the military. They've spent most of their time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they had no insurance at the baseline. So I just think that the work that Case Western has done with the Ohio Guard is extraordinarily important in identifying subgroups that we should focus on within the military, and we will provide more detail for the record, and I thank the chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Recently, with the chairman of our whole committee, I had the opportunity to go to Israel and see we not only sustain our industrial base, we help some of our friends sustain their industrial base and get something back in return. And I think one of the better investments that appeared to me that we've made was in Iron Dome. We went to the company that manufactures it, also went saw it deployed in the field. And I was just curious, are the technology benefits coming back to us, and what are the things we're doing to harvest that and make sure that if our friends have developed something that's capable and robust and that we've helped finance and deploy. And let me tell you, the gratitude was tremendous about what the United States had done in this case. I'm just curious what we're doing to make sure that we get whatever benefit out of the investment that's appropriate for us as well.
Well, we try to do just that, not just with the Israelis, but all of our Tier 1 partners, and I think there is a sense of shared best practice. There does at times get into the consideration, industrial jealousies, et cetera, that we try to work through. As to Iron Dome, we have had pretty robust opportunity to analyze it. It certainly seems to meet the Israelis' needs very, very well. We didn't, the last I checked, find a lot that we could harvest out of it, but having said that, the fact that we had the chance to sit down and work with our Israeli partners was very, very important and appreciative. And as you said, Mr. Cole, they have been enormously grateful for the support that they've received from us, and I don't think we could ask for better cooperation.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cole. Yes, Mr. Wiskoski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, Secretary and General, I would very sincerely and seriously associate myself with the observations that Ms. Capter made relative to transport in the Great Lakes. Too often people forget states like New York or Minnesota or Indiana or Ohio or places are actually a fourth seacoast, and would hope that people do note that fact. I would just, in the time I have, want to say that I support your efforts as far as your regionally aligned forces. since our standing military is going to be smaller, do appreciate that you're looking for innovative, low-cost, small footprint initiatives to work with others relative to counterinsurgency. I particularly am pleased with the department's decision on increasing assistance relative to going after the Lord's Resistance Army. I understand that you have, if you would, for these partnerships, protected that program in the 15 budget. Might you just briefly for us explain where in that budget request those types of items would appear and we could look for them?
Oh, the state partnership program, is that?
Yes.
Yeah. So we've increased 27%.
Well, not just that, but for all of, in general, the partnership capabilities that you have.
So first off, what we've done under Region Line Forces is there's several things. First, we have some baseline activity in our budget, our O&M budget, that allows us to conduct Region Line Force activities, whether it be in support of NATO, whether it be in Africa, et cetera. But the other thing we have found when we ran the pilot in Africa, that out of the $98 million that were spent last year, only $4 million came out of the Army budget. We found $94 million in other pots of money within DOD and the State Department that we were able to leverage in order for us to support efforts in building partner capacity as well as other activities that we've conducted. And so what we're doing is we're leveraging the monies that have been allocated across the Department of Defense as well as the Department of State to execute this. And we believe we can do this, continue to do this. There are funds set up specifically to go after these kinds of missions. And so we'll be able to we'll fund some minor portions of it out of the Army O&M, but we'll try to utilize these other budget capabilities that are specifically targeted towards building partner capacity and developing other countries' militaries. And we're using that as our funding to do this, and we've been very successful so far in doing that.
Resources, is that a line item or is that dispersed throughout your budget?
I'd have to get back with you specifically what it is.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's substantial, though. Judge Carter.
Get this thing turned on. Recently, we, in fact, yesterday evening, we had a discussion about PACOM, and looking at that map, it sure as heck looked like the Pacific Theater in World War II as far as the area we're talking about. And and the President and the administration has announced a shift to that area. So, General Odierno, I'm well aware of what we have in Korea and what we're doing in Korea, but as you look at at PACOM and the possible needs and involvement of the Army, I'd like your opinion as to what you think, and the Secretary's opinion about what you think our Army involvement potentially could be in PACOM.
Yeah, so we have 80,000 soldiers, Guard, Reserve, active component assigned to Pacific Command. And so as I said, about 20,000 of those in Korea. So we have 60,000 that are conducting missions throughout many different areas in the Asia-Pacific region. There's several, we have 5 treaty allies, South Korea, Japan, Thailand, Philippines, Australia, that we're working very much with. We are on this issue of partnership activities to facilitate U.S. relationships, gain access, provide security for global commons, and support some of our contingency planning. We're looking at our where we put pre-positioned stocks, not only to meet a range of activities from humanitarian assistance support all the way up to supporting potential deployments of forces in the Asia-Pacific region. So it's a wide variety of engagements that we are conducting. And just giving an example, we just did a joint airborne operation with the Thai Army, for example. We just did a humanitarian assistance exercise with the Chinese in Hawaii. So there are activities such as this that we're doing to build confidence, to build our relationships, to build familiarity, which helps us in developing our security activities throughout the Asia-Pacific region. That's what we're going to continue to do. It is a commitment, a significant commitment that the Army is making in this area.
Can I just add, and I think it's understandable, people talk about the Pacific and you immediately think of a lot of ocean and a lot of sky, but the reason people are interested in those oceans and skies because there's a lot of people who live around them. There are 36 nations in the Pacific region. Of those, 27 have military, and of those 27, 26 of them, the Army is the largest of their militaries. And of those 27, 20 of the defense chiefs are Army officers. So however we view it, the Asian nations of that region view their Army as their principal actor in military matters. And while we always have to think about conflict and going to war, our main purpose, particularly in that theater, is to prevent and shape, to work with partners to build partnership capacity. And there, I would argue, the Army is better postured in terms of ability to work with other nations than perhaps any of the other services. So we think we have a very important part. And the PACOM commanders, Admiral Sam Locklear, who I understand was with you yesterday, was with the SASC a day or two earlier, I think would be one of the first to validate that.
Okay. I think he did validate that. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Owens. Thank you, Judge.
Thank you. First of all, certainly we'd like to see the St. Lawrence Seaway used for the repatriation of those items. I want to go back to this whole PACOM area. I'm assuming that the analysis that you've applied has led you to the conclusion that China is the next emerging, if not emerged, superpower. And that in order to have that deterrent effect, therefore we've shifted our position toward Southeast Asia. Is that a fair analysis?
Well, certainly China is an emerging military and economic power, and I don't know as that one needs to do a lot of analysis on that, but the pivot to the Pacific is really based on a broader range of considerations. I mean, if you look at India, another very major emerging power, and if you look at where the great economic interests of this nation lie and where we want to do everything we can to promote peace and security, the Pacific would seem to be a good place to start. Clearly there are security challenges there. We've already talked about Korea. You know, the chief has spent some recent time in China trying to build relationships with their military and their army, and we want to continue to do that. But it does posture us to better, we hope, productively and cooperatively engage with China.
It would also be logistically somewhat difficult to move large numbers of troops in and around that region, I would think.
Yeah, I think, again, obviously it is. The distances involved makes it very difficult. So that's why it's important for us to posture certain capabilities there that allow us to do that. Again, I would focus on, I think in the Asia-Pacific region, it really is about protecting our economic interests. And what we want to do is have a balanced approach to the Asia-Pacific region that allows us to continue to move forward economically, that helps to keep us as a strong nation. And so what we're trying to do is develop strong relationships, to build partnerships that allow us to sustain and make everyone realize that we are a Pacific power. The Asia-Pacific region is very important to the United States. It's important to us, as the Secretary said, economically, and it's important to us to sustain stability. So this is not about having another Cold War. This is about sustaining a level of stability that allows us to continue to develop economically as we continue to increase significantly our trade in the Pacific region. And I think it's about that preventing conflict and shaping the environment for us to continue to grow in strength as a nation economically. And that's the strategy we're pulling forward by building partnerships, by having access, in order to prevent conflict in the future. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
And may we add also, if the gentleman, the pre-positioning of assets, which are highly important and do represent a substantial contribution to stability and our recognizing our continued interest in the area. Thank you, Mr. Owens. Ms. Granger.
In 2011, the Air Force proposed a plan that was opposed by the National Guard and also the governors. And the Congress really didn't appreciate or respond very well to that plan. It now appears that the Army's attempting a very similar tactic. So given the Guard's critical role both domestically and internationally, I'm concerned that the Army's proposal ignores not only the concerns of the governors, but also the concerns of a seated member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So I'd like to know what you're doing to work with the Guard and our governors to incorporate changes that will enable them to support your plan. Have you incorporated any of the Guard's suggestions or alternatives?
If I may just open with a few comments. I think there are enormous differences between the path the Air Force took and the path we took. First of all, the Air Force began with its cuts against the Guard. The Army has, for the last 2 years, totally immunized the Guard from cuts, while we have taken substantial reductions across the board. And that was to protect the operationalized aspects of the Guard that we have built. I mean, this wasn't forced upon us. We built over the last 13 years, and we want to continue to sustain. The other is, unlike the Air Force, we engaged the professional staff members here on the Hill, kept them fully informed. I'm not suggesting that means everybody buys into it, but I think when the Air Force hit the street with their proposal, it was a surprise to a lot of people. Again, we didn't do that, and we did involve the Guard in the discussions from day one. So I'll let the Chief, again, not that they agree with it necessarily, but they were involved.
As we looked at this proposal, this is about what's best for the Army, and we are very cognizant of the role the Guard and Reserve plays, and that was taken into consideration as we made these recommendations. I would also say that, again, comparing it to the Air Force has 70% of their structure in the active component and only 30% in the Guard. The Army in 2012 was about 51% to 49% active to reserve. When we finish this, we're going to be 54% reserve and 46% active. So we have taken the majority of the cuts out of the active. So it's a very different situation. We recognize the importance of the Guard and Reserve. This is not about the Guard versus the Reserve. I mean, the active versus the Guard, or the active versus. This is about coming up with the right balance. And we've recognized the fact that the active component is more expensive, so we've taken a significantly more majority of the cuts out of the active component. We have done that. But it comes to a time where, based on what we believe we need to execute our defense strategy, we can't go any lower in the active component, so we've had to take some out of the Guard. And that's, the budget is driving us to those decisions. We understand that we have to have the right integration and the right capabilities and depth that the Guard provides us, that the U.S. Army Reserve provides us. It's critical to what we're doing. And I think the Secretary and I have recognized that in the budget submission. We recognize the importance. What we can't do is maintain structure that we can't sustain at the right readiness levels. So we've gone to the lowest level we can in the active. We want to take a little bit out of the Guard because we want them to stay in operational reserve. We do not want them to go back to a strategic reserve. And I worry if we keep too much structure in the Guard, they'll end up being a strategic reserve because we can't fund the training that's necessary.
Did the Guard, I understand they presented several alternatives to what did you consider the alternatives?
We absolutely did. I don't want to debate that here, but in their alternatives, in some cases, it actually increased the size of the Guard, and so it was difficult. But
maybe we'll leave that discussion for a future date, but certainly the members have a keen interest. Moving towards the finish line, Mr. Ryan, and then Ms. McCollum, and then we may be
thank you, Mr.
towards
Chairman.
a adjournment. Thank you.
Brief question, as we're all concerned with what's happening in the Ukraine and Russia. Should the Russians continue to move aggressively in that region and in the Ukraine, what does that mean? And NATO would have to respond, for example. What would that mean for the United States Army?
Well, I can't comment on the decisions. What I have to make sure is we're prepared. So my responsibility is to make sure that the U.S. Army is prepared to respond as part of a joint force, as part of NATO. So I've got to make sure that we ensure that we're ready if asked. The decision for us will be external to that. So what I'm focused on is improving our readiness in combat service support, and combat aviation capabilities to make sure we're ready to respond, whether it's from a humanitarian assistance aspect or any other aspect. And that's what I'm focused on now.
What would the number be? I see we got 28,000 soldiers in Europe, 940 in the Balkans. What would our commitment level be, do you think?
I simply don't know. And I would just remind people that actually some of the soldiers that are assigned to Europe actually right now are in Afghanistan. So it just depends on what they would ask us to do. But we would take the whole Army, CONUS, and whatever else, depending on what we're asked to do. We'll take capabilities from across the Army to go after the problem.
Thank you, Mr. Ryan. Ms. McCullum.
Thank you. And to go to the issue of readiness, the President had proposed a $56 billion in additional spending above the Murray-Ryan budget for 2015, and that was paid for with tax reforms and mandatory spending cuts. So about half of the $56 billion would have gone to non-defense spending, and that would have about $28 billion for defense spending, broadly across several bills. So it was envisioned that part of the Army's piece of this account would have been about $7.5 billion, and $4.2 billion was for operation and maintenance accounts. And some of the proposals were to go towards readiness enhancements of all services, including $600 million in training and other readiness-related increases for the Army. So could maybe you describe a little more about some of the projects and activities that you would have been able to include in the Army's portion of this? And given the fact that readiness is one of your highest priorities, can you also say maybe why some of these activities were left in this proposal, or are they just really, the extra deluxe that you would like to see our Army have for readiness?
If I may start, Ms. McCollum. This Opportunity Growth and Security Initiative is the President's, I think, laudable attempt to try to work with Congress to increase, of course, in DOD's case, the top line by, as you correctly noted, over $26 billion. For the Army, I wouldn't say it was a luxurious thing, but it would allow us to recover our readiness and to do some, to restore our what's called RSM, our investment and sustainment monies for our facilities to a more historic target of about 90%. So while we think it's very, very important money, it allows us, most importantly, to regain readiness more quickly than we can under the 15 plan that was adopted under the bipartisan budget agreement. It would be very, very positive news for this Army.
Yeah, I would just, this is essential readiness funding. We do not have the funding to sustain the level of readiness we think is appropriate for the Army under the current budget. And so with this would improve our readiness more. It would give us more readiness number to ensure our aviation is more ready, our combat brigades are more ready, our combat service support, but also it has to do with our installations. We're only funding about 50% of our installation needs now in readiness, and that gets to family program. We're not fully funding family programs, but it gets to ranges, which we're not able to sustain or upkeep. It gets to some of our equipment that we're not able to sustain or upkeep. So this additional money allows us to fund that, which we think is the appropriate level of readiness necessary to sustain the readiness over the long term in the Army.
Thank you very much, Ms. McCullum. Gentlemen, Mr. Secretary General Odierno, thank you for your testimony this morning and I should say this afternoon. And we look forward to getting the OCO portion to us sooner rather than later. And on behalf of the entire committee, we thank you for your leadership and the men and women you represent who honor us by their service every day. We stand adjourned.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.